Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through ancient Norse myths and the quiet wisdom they hold. These are stories of gods and monsters, of wisdom and foolishness, told not with thunder and lightning, but with the soft rhythm of a bedtime story. Dim your lights. Settle under your blanket. Let the noise of the day fade away, and if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, sharing these quiet moments together across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin our journey into the world of the Norse gods, where even the mightiest tales can be told with a whisper. You find yourself in ancient Asgard, where the morning mist clings to golden halls and the gods are just beginning to stir. But today, there's something different in the air, a tension that makes even the bravest gods glance over their shoulders. They're thinking about a wolf. Not just any wolf, mind you. This wolf has a name that makes the gods uncomfortable when they whisper it. Fenrir. He's growing larger each day and the gods can't shake a terrible prophecy from their minds. One day this wolf will devour Odin himself when the world ends. Picture Odin sitting in his great hall, his ravens perched nearby, telling him all the news from across the 9 worlds. The All-Father strokes his long grey beard, thinking, the problem isn't what Fenrir has done, it's what he will do, and that makes everything so much more complicated. You see, the gods of Asgard aren't cruel by nature. They could have simply killed the wolf when he was small, but there's something about taking a life for crimes not yet committed that sits wrong, even with gods. So instead, they decided to raise Fenrir themselves, thinking they could change his fate through kindness. Imagine the early days, when Fenrir was just a pup, no bigger than any ordinary wolf. The gods would watch him play in the courtyards of Asgard, rolling in the grass, chasing his own tail. Only one god was brave enough to actually feed him by hand. Tyr, the god of war and justice. Every day, Tyr would bring meat to the growing wolf, speaking to him gently, treating him as a friend. But prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves, don't they? The more the gods worried about Fenrir growing dangerous, the more they began to treat him with suspicion. They measured his shoulders each week. They counted his teeth. They watched how easily he could snap thick branches between his jaws. And Fenrir, being no fool, began to notice their worried glances. Have you ever felt that uncomfortable awareness when people are watching you, waiting for you to do something wrong? The wolf felt it too. The warmth in their voices grew strained. The easy laughter stopped when he approached. The gods held meeting after meeting in their great halls. You can imagine them sitting around massive wooden tables, their voices low, debating what to do. Some argued for exile, send Fenrir away to some distant realm. Others suggested binding him with chains, just temporarily, just until they could figure out a better solution. It was Odin who finally made the decision, though it clearly troubled him. Looking at the wolf who had grown as large as a horse, seeing the intelligence in those yellow eyes, he knew they couldn't wait any longer. But how do you chain someone who's done nothing wrong? They decided to make it seem like a game. Fenrir, they called one bright morning. We want to test your great strength. We've heard you're the strongest creature in all the 9 worlds. Surely you could break any chain we might put on you. Fenrir's ears perked up. He was proud of his strength. And honestly, after months of suspicious looks, it felt good to have the gods acknowledging his power again. Bring your chains, he said with confidence. I'll show you what I can do. The first chain they brought was called lading. It was thick as a man's arm, forged by the finest smiths in Asgard. They wrapped it around Fenrir's massive chest and legs, securing it with heavy iron locks. The gods stepped back, watching. Fenrir took a deep breath, tensed his powerful muscles, and with one tremendous effort, shattered the chain into 1,000 pieces. Metal links flew across the courtyard like deadly rain. The gods applauded, but you could see the worry in their eyes growing deeper. They tried again with an even stronger chain called Drommi, thick as a tree trunk and enchanted with binding spells. Surely this would hold any creature, they thought. But Fenrir broke this one too, even more easily than the first. He seemed to be getting stronger with each passing day. That night, Odin sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. The dancing flames reminded him of Ragnarök, the end of all things, when Fenrir would fulfill the prophecy and devour him whole. Something had to be done, but what chains could hold a wolf that broke the strongest bonds like spider webs? Then Odin remembered the dark elves, those master craftsmen who lived in Alfheim and could create wonders beyond imagination. He sent a secret message to them, asking for something that had never been made before, a chain that could not be broken, no matter how strong the creature trapped within it. The dark elves worked for months in their underground forges, using ingredients that sound impossible even today. They took the sound of a cat's footstep. Have you ever noticed how silently cats move? They gathered the breath of a fish, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, and the spittle of a bird. These things that barely exist, that are more idea than substance, they wove together into a chain unlike anything ever seen. It was thin as silk ribbon, light as air, and soft to the touch. They called it Gleipnir, and when they sent it to Odin, it came with a warning. This chain would hold anything, but the binding would come at a terrible cost. When the gods showed Gleipnir to Fenrir, the wolf immediately became suspicious. After breaking 2 mighty chains, they wanted him to be bound by something that looked like it couldn't hold a sparrow. "This smells of magic," Fenrir said, his nose wrinkling. "I don't trust it." The gods insisted it was just another test of strength. "If you're truly as powerful as you claim," they said, "this little ribbon should be nothing to you. But if you're afraid..." Fenrir's pride was stung, but he wasn't stupid. "I'll agree to be bound by this," he said slowly, "but only if one of you places his hand in my mouth as a sign of good faith. If this is truly just a test, you have nothing to fear." The gods looked at each other uncomfortably. They all knew that Gleipnir would not break, which meant whoever put their hand in Fenrir's mouth would lose it when the wolf realized he'd been betrayed. For long moments, nobody moved. Then, Tyr stepped forward. The god who had fed Fenrir every day, who had been his only true friend among the gods, slowly approached. "I'll do it," he said quietly. As he placed his right hand between Fenrir's massive jaws, you could see the sadness in his eyes. He was betraying the only creature who had ever truly trusted him. The gods wrapped Gleipnir around Fenrir's legs and chest. It felt like being embraced by moonbeams, so light and soft. Fenrir began to struggle, gently at first, then with growing desperation as he realized the truth. The more he fought, the tighter the magical chain became. When Fenrir understood he was truly trapped, betrayed by those he had trusted, his jaws snapped shut. Tyr's hand was severed at the wrist, and the god of war became forever after known as the one-handed god. Blood dripped steadily onto the ground of Asgard, staining it red. The gods chained Gleipnir to a massive stone called Gjörl, and buried it deep in the earth. They placed a sword in Fenrir's mouth, point upward, so he could not bite or speak threats against them. His howls of rage and betrayal echoed across all 9 worlds. But here's what the gods didn't fully understand in that moment. Prophecies have a way of making themselves come true, especially when you try too hard to prevent them. By binding Fenrir, by breaking the trust he had placed in them, they ensured that when Ragnarök finally came, the wolf would indeed devour Odin with joy rather than reluctance. As night falls over Asgard and the gods return to their halls, they can still hear Fenrir's muffled howls in the distance. They tell themselves they did what was necessary, that they protected their realm from a terrible fate, but deep down, they know they may have created the very enemy they feared. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Asgard's walls, Fenrir waits, bound but not broken, dreaming of the day when all chains will shatter and all debts will be paid. What do you think weighs heavier on the gods' minds as they try to sleep? The threat they've contained, or the trust they've broken? Speaking of broken trust and strange prophecies, let's drift back to an earlier time, when the seeds of Asgard's greatest troubles were first planted. You've just heard about Fenrir, the wolf whose binding would haunt the gods, but have you ever wondered where such a creature came from? The answer lies with Loki, the trickster god, and a love story so unusual that even the gods found it difficult to understand. Picture a time when Loki was younger, more curious than malicious, wandering the 9 worlds simply because he could never stay still for long. On one of his journeys to Jotunheim, the land of the giants, Loki encountered someone who would change the course of mythology itself. Her name was Angrboda, which means the one who brings grief. She was a giantess, but not the crude, mountain-sized monsters that most gods imagined when they thought of giant kind. Angrboda was ancient and wise, with eyes like deep forest pools and hair the color of storm clouds. She knew magic that even Odin hadn't learned, could see threads of fate that the Norns themselves sometimes missed. When she and Loki met, it was like 2 pieces of a puzzle clicking together, both outcasts, both complicated, both carrying destinies too large for comfort. You might wonder what their courtship was like. Picture long walks through twisted forests where the trees whispered secrets, evenings spent by fires that burned blue and green instead of red and gold. Loki would tell jokes that made Angrboda laugh like distant thunder, while she shared wisdom about the deeper magics that hold the worlds together. They understood each other in ways that neither had experienced before. Both were shapeshifters. Both were caught between worlds, Loki between the gods and giants, Angrboda between the wild magic of ancient times and the more ordered world emerging around them. Their love affair was intense but shadowed, as if they both knew it would lead to something momentous and difficult. When Angrboda told Loki she was expecting children, they both felt a strange mixture of joy and foreboding. The magic around them grew stronger, more unpredictable. Plants would bloom out of season when she passed. The northern lights danced more frequently in the sky above their hidden home. The first child born to them was Fenrir, though at the time he seemed like nothing more than an unusually large and intelligent wolf pup. Loki would carry him on his shoulders as they explored Jotunheim together. The young wolf was playful, affectionate, and showed an early talent for understanding speech far better than any ordinary animal. Angrboda would watch them play together, and feel that familiar tug of prophecy at the edge of her consciousness. She could see glimpses of the future, flashes of golden halls, the sound of breaking chains, a terrible howl of betrayal. But when she tried to focus on these visions, they slipped away like morning mist. The second child was even more unusual than the first. Jormungandr emerged as a serpent, but not the tiny garden snake you might expect. Even as a newborn, he was the length of Loki's arm, with scales that shimmered like oil on water and eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. Loki was fascinated by this son who could curl around his wrist like a living bracelet, whispering in a voice like rustling leaves. Jormungandr grew faster than seemed possible, shedding his skin weekly, each new form larger and more magnificent than the last. Within months he was too large for their home, too large for the forests of Jotunheim. The young serpent was gentle with his parents, but there was something in his nature that called to the deepest waters of the world. He would disappear for days at a time, swimming in underground rivers, exploring caves that led toward the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Each time he returned, he was larger and carried with him the scent of distant oceans. Then came their third child, and she was the most puzzling of all. Hel appeared to be half living and half dead. One side of her body, beautiful and warm like any young girl, the other side pale and cold as a corpse. When she smiled, it was heartbreaking and terrifying at the same time. Angrboda understood immediately that this daughter was meant for something beyond the ordinary world of the living. Hel could see spirits that others couldn't, could speak with the dead as easily as with the living. Even as a small child, she would sometimes stop playing and cock her head, listening to conversations no one else could hear. Loki loved all his children fiercely, but he could feel the weight of destiny settling around them like a heavy cloak. These weren't ordinary children who would grow up to lead normal lives. Each of them carried within themselves the seeds of myth and legend, of endings and transformations that would shake the very foundations of the 9 worlds. For a while the strange family lived in relative peace in their hidden corner of Jotunheim. Loki would visit Asgard occasionally, keeping his family secret from the other gods. He knew they wouldn't understand his love for a giantess, wouldn't appreciate the unique gifts his children possessed. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when those secrets involve creatures of such unusual power. The ravens of Odin see everything, remember everything. Whispers began to reach Asgard about Loki's hidden family, about children whose very existence seemed to bend the laws of nature. When Odin finally confronted Loki about his secret family, the conversation took place on one of those grey days when even the Rainbow Bridge looked muted and sad. "I know about your children," the All-Father said quietly. "I've seen what they will become." Loki's heart sank. He knew that look in Odin's eye, the weight of prophecy and preemptive action. "They're just children," he said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "They've done nothing wrong." "Not yet," Odin replied. "But the prophecies speak of what they will do. Your wolf will devour me. Your serpent will poison the sky itself. Your daughter will rule over the dishonored dead. Can we ignore such warnings?" The pain in Loki's voice was unmistakable. "You're talking about my family, about innocent children who didn't choose their natures any more than you chose to be king of the gods." But Odin had made his decision. The children would be taken from their parents and dealt with according to their perceived threats. Fenrir would be brought to Asgard, where the gods could watch him. Jormungandr would be cast into the ocean that surrounds Midgard. Hel would be given dominion over a realm of the dead, where she could rule but not threaten the living. The day the gods came to take the children was one of the saddest in all mythology. Angerboda had seen it coming in her visions. But knowing something will happen doesn't make it easier to bear. She held each of her children close one last time, whispering blessings and promises that they would see each other again. Loki watched his family being torn apart, and felt something break inside his heart that would never fully heal. This was the moment, many say, when the trickster god began his slow transformation from mischievous ally to bitter enemy of Asgard. As the gods departed with the children, taking them to their separate fates, Angerboda stood alone in her empty home, and spoke a prophecy of her own. What you do to them now will be remembered. When the final battle comes, they will stand against you with the fury of children who were never allowed to choose their own paths. And so began the greatest tragedy in Norse mythology, not a tale of evil conquering good, but of fear creating the very enemies it sought to prevent. Each of Loki's children, separated from their family and treated as threats rather than individuals, would indeed become exactly what the prophecies foretold. In the quiet that followed, as Angerboda gathered the scattered toys her children had left behind, you can't help but wonder, would things have been different if the gods had chosen trust over fear, love over prophecy? Sometimes the most boring question is also the most important one. If you're finding comfort in these gentle retellings of ancient myths, and if these stories are helping you unwind from your day, consider subscribing to join our community of nighttime listeners. There's something special about sharing these quiet moments together, don't you think? From the sorrow of a family torn apart, let's follow one of those children to his new home beneath the waves. You remember Jormungandr, the serpent son of Loki and Angerboda, who grew too large for any land to contain him. When Odin cast him into the vast ocean surrounding Midgard, the god thought he was solving a problem. Instead, he was creating one of the most magnificent and lonely creatures in all the 9 worlds. Imagine the moment of Jormungandra's exile. One day he was swimming in the familiar rivers of Jotunheim, playing games with his father, listening to his mother's ancient songs. The next, he was falling through clouds toward an endless expanse of grey-blue water that stretched to every horizon. The impact when he hit the ocean was tremendous, sending waves crashing against distant shores, startling whales in the deepest trenches. But for Jormungandr, it felt almost like coming home. The salt water welcomed him, supported his growing weight in ways that land never could. Here, finally, was space enough for him to truly stretch and grow. In those early days alone in the world ocean, Jormungandr explored his new realm with the curiosity of any young creature in a vast playground. He dove to depths where no light penetrated, where the water itself seemed thick as honey and strange fish with their own lanterns swam in slow, dreaming circles. The pressure that would crush any ordinary being felt comfortable against his scales. He discovered underwater mountains taller than anything on land, valleys so deep they seemed to lead toward the roots of Yggdrasil itself. In the silence of the depths, broken only by the distant songs of whales, Jormungandr began to understand that he was meant for something larger than family picnics and childhood games. As months passed, and he continued growing, always growing, Jormungandr began to encounter the edges of his new domain. Swimming north, he found walls of ice that groaned and sang as they moved. Swimming south, he discovered waters so warm they steamed even in the depths. East and west led to strange currents that carried scents of distant lands, spices and flowers he had no names for. But here's the remarkable thing about Jormungandra's exile. Instead of becoming bitter about his separation from his family, he seemed to embrace his role as guardian of the world ocean. Perhaps it was his serpent nature, or perhaps it was a wisdom inherited from his mother, Angerboda, but he began to see his encirclement of Midgard, not as a prison, but as a purpose. He established patterns in his swimming, great circular routes that took him around the entire world. Sailors began to notice changes in the tides that came with mysterious regularity. Ocean currents shifted in ways that brought warm water to cold lands and cool breezes to hot shores. The very circulation of the world's waters began to depend on Jormungandra's movements. The serpent discovered he could communicate with sea creatures in ways he'd never been able to speak with land dwellers. Whales would swim alongside him for days, sharing songs that carried news from one side of the world to the other. Dolphins played elaborate games of tag with different sections of his mile-long body. Even the kraken, those ancient creatures of the deepest places, treated him with respectful curiosity rather than fear. Schools of fish would follow in his wake, feeding on the nutrients his passage stirred up from the ocean floor. Where Jormungandr swam, the sea became more alive, more vibrant. Fishermen in distant villages noticed that their nets came up fuller after storms that carried the serpent's scent on the wind. But perhaps the most interesting part of Jormungand's story is how he dealt with loneliness. Imagine being the only one of your kind, too large to have real conversations with most creatures, too different to ever truly belong anywhere. Instead of despair, the world serpent found a different solution. He began to dream, but these weren't ordinary dreams. They were vast, oceanic dreams that lasted for months at a time. In these dreams, he swam through seas that existed in other worlds. Other times, he dreamed of conversations with his siblings Fenrir and Hel. Family reunions that felt so real he would wake up calling their names into the empty water. Sometimes surface dwellers would catch glimpses of these dreams. Sailors reported seeing impossible colors in the water, hearing music that seemed to come from the depths themselves. The aurora borealis would dance more brightly on nights when Jormungandra's dreams were particularly vivid, as if his sleeping mind somehow influenced the very atmosphere above. Vikings who spent their lives on the ocean developed a complex relationship with the world serpent. They feared him. Certainly, any creature capable of swallowing islands whole deserved healthy respect. But they also honored him, as part of the natural order, the great serpent whose movements kept the world's waters flowing, whose presence maintained the delicate balance between sea and sky. Some brave sailors even claimed to have seen his eyes in the depths during terrible storms, great golden orbs like underwater suns, watching them with ancient intelligence. Those who survived such encounters always said the same thing. They felt no malice from the serpent, only a vast, patient awareness that seemed to encompass the entire ocean. As years turned to decades and decades to centuries, Jormungandr grew until he could indeed encircle all of Midgard with his body, grasping his own tail in his mouth like the ancient symbol of eternity. But this wasn't a prison, it was a meditation, a way of holding the world together through his own being. The serpent learned to taste the health of the world through the ocean's waters. He could sense when droughts plagued distant lands by the way the rivers tasted when they reached the sea. He felt the changing seasons and the temperature gradients of his circular realm. In a very real sense, he became the pulse of the world itself. During these long, peaceful centuries, Jormungandr sometimes received visitors. Sea witches would summon him to the surface to ask for wisdom about weather and tides. Occasionally, his father Loki would appear in some borrowed form, a seal, a whale, sometimes just a voice in the wind, to check on his exiled son. These visits were bittersweet. Loki would tell stories of the upper world, of politics among the gods, of Fenrir's fate in Asgard. In return, Jormungandr would share the slow wisdom he'd learnt in his oceanic exile, patience, the value of seeing the world as a connected whole, the peace that comes from accepting your place in the larger pattern. "Do you ever regret it?" Loki asked during one such visit, floating beside his son's great head as waves lapped gently around them. Being cast out, being alone. Jormungandr considered this for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the stars above. "I am not alone," he said finally. "I am connected to everything, every drop of water that flows, every tide that turns, every storm that cleanses the air. I am part of all of it. The gods thought they were sending me into exile, but they gave me the entire world as my home." Yet prophecy has a way of calling in its debts, even from the most peaceful of creatures. The same visions that troubled Angrboda spoke of a time when Jormungandr would release his tail, when his movements would no longer steady the world but shake it to its foundations. During Ragnarök, the gentle giant of the depths would rise from the ocean, bringing tidal waves and poison clouds. But until that distant day, Jormungandr continues his patient circles in the world ocean, dreaming vast dreams, maintaining the delicate balance that keeps the waters flowing and the world spinning on its axis. Sometimes, on very quiet nights when you're near the ocean, you might hear the distant sound of something impossibly large, moving through deep water, not threatening, just present, like the world's own heartbeat made audible. What would it be like, do you think, to carry such responsibility with such grace, to find purpose and peace in what others meant as punishment? While her brother Jormungandr found purpose in the world's waters, the third child of Loki faced a very different kind of exile. Hel, half alive and half dead, was given dominion over a realm that no living soul was meant to see, yet somehow, she made it into something resembling home. Picture the moment when young Hel first arrived in the realm that would bear her name. Odin had decreed that she should rule over those who died of sickness or old age, the inglorious deaths that earned no place in Valhalla's golden halls. It might have seemed like another cruel exile, banishing a child to oversee the dreary afterlife of the forgotten. But Hel possessed a unique gift that even Odin hadn't fully understood. She could see death not as an ending, but as a transition. Her dual nature, living and dead existing side by side in the same small form, gave her a perspective that no purely living or purely dead being could match. The realm she inherited was bleak beyond description. Endless grey plains stretched under a sky that knew no sun, no stars, only the perpetual twilight of neither day nor night. The river Gel flowed through this landscape like a boundary between hope and despair, its waters dark and cold as winter midnight. The dead who came to her were not the glorious warriors who feasted in Odin's hall. These were farmers who died quietly in their beds, children taken by fever, old women who simply wore out like well-used tools. They arrived confused, frightened, mourning not just their own deaths, but their separation from everything they had known. A goddess with less wisdom might have ruled through fear or indifference, but Hel, despite her youth, understood something profound about death and comfort. She began to reshape her realm not as a place of punishment, but as a place of rest for those who had lived ordinary lives with extraordinary dignity. She built her hall Gleipnir, with walls that seemed solid to the dead but transparent to the living. This wasn't cruel irony. It was kindness. The deceased could still watch over their families, could see their children growing up, their fields being tended, their stories being told around winter fires. Death became less like abandonment, and more like watching from a quiet room next door. The furniture in Hel's hall had names that reflected her understanding of what the dead truly needed. Her bed was called sick bed, not because it brought illness, but because it offered the kind of rest that comes only after long suffering has finally ended. Her table was hunger, not to starve her guests, but to remind them that they had once known want and need, and those days were over. Hel's servants were beings who, like herself, existed between states, neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something altogether different. They moved through the hall with quiet efficiency, understanding without words what each newly arrived soul needed most. Some required solitude to process their transition, others craved company and conversation. The goddess developed routines that brought structure and comfort to the timeless realm. Each day, though day had no meaning there, she would walk through her domain, speaking with those who sought her attention. Her voice carried the authority of rulership on her living side, and the peace of acceptance on her dead side. She learned that the dead rarely wanted grand gestures or cosmic revelations. Mostly, they wanted their lives to have mattered, to know that their simple acts of love and duty hadn't been forgotten. So Hel became a keeper of small memories, the way a mother had hummed while braiding her daughter's hair, how a farmer had always saved the best apple for his horse, the pattern a weaver had invented that no one else could duplicate. One of the most touching aspects of Hel's rule was how she handled the arrival of children. When young souls came to her realm, confused and frightened by their separation from life, she would sit with them personally, her living side warm and comforting, her dead side helping them understand that this new state wasn't something to fear. She told them stories that bridged the gap between life and death, tales of seeds that had to be buried in dark earth before they could grow into flowers, of caterpillars that disappeared completely before becoming butterflies, of winter that seemed like an ending, but was really just rest before spring's return. The goddess also faced petitioners from the living world. Occasionally, someone would make the perilous journey to her realm seeking the return of a loved one. These visits were always difficult, not because Hel was cruel, but because she understood better than anyone the natural order of transitions. When Balder, the most beloved of the gods, was killed through Loki's trickery, all of Asgard mourned. Frigg, his mother, sent messengers to Hel's realm, begging for her son's return. The request put Hel in an impossible position: uphold the natural laws of death, or show mercy to grieving parents. Hel's response revealed the wisdom she'd gained in her unusual role. She would release Baldur, she said. If every living thing in all the 9 worlds would weep for him, it seemed like a reasonable request. Surely all creation would mourn the death of the god of light and beauty. And indeed, nearly everything did weep. Trees shed their leaves, animals cried out in sorrow, even stones wept moisture from their surfaces. But one old giantess, alone in a cave, refused to shed tears. Some say this giantess was Loki in disguise, ensuring that his victim would remain dead. Others suggest she was just a bitter old creature who had never received kindness from the beautiful god. Hel accepted this result without anger or surprise. She understood that grief, like love, cannot be commanded. Baldur remained in her realm, not as punishment, but because the universe itself had declared through that single withheld tear that his time among the living was truly finished. This decision established Hel's reputation for absolute fairness. She didn't make exceptions based on political pressure or personal relationships. Death was death, and the boundary she guarded was necessary for the proper functioning of all existence. As centuries passed, Hel's realm became less a place of exile and more a necessary part of the world's balance. She developed relationships with the other death goddesses across different mythologies, sharing wisdom about the care of souls in transition. Her domain became a model for how the afterlife could be managed with both justice and compassion. The goddess also maintained contact with her family when possible. Loki would visit occasionally, always marveling at how his daughter had transformed punishment into purpose. These reunions were complicated by the fact that Hel could see the threads of fate more clearly than most. She knew that her father's path would eventually lead to tragedy, but also understood that some destinies cannot be changed, only accepted. During these visits, they would walk together through the grey gardens Hel had cultivated. Not the vibrant flowers of the living world, but subtle, beautiful plants that bloomed in shades of silver and pewter, their beauty accessible only to eyes that had learned to see beyond the simple categories of life and death. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Loki asked during one such walk, much as he had asked Jormungandr. Hel considered the question, while watching a group of newly arrived souls, learning to tend the memory gardens where the dead could cultivate their most precious recollections. "Different how?" she replied. "I am exactly what I was meant to be, a bridge between states, a guardian of transitions. The gods thought they were disposing of a problem child, but they gave me the most important job in all the 9 worlds." And indeed, prophecy spoke of Hel's crucial role in the final battle. When Ragnarök comes, she will march with an army of the dishonored dead, not out of malice, but because even endings require proper management. The goddess, who learned to make exile into service, will ensure that the twilight of the gods proceeds with dignity and order. But until that distant day, Hel continues her quiet work in the realm of the dead, proving that sometimes the most profound power lies not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient, compassionate care of those who need help with the most difficult transition of all. In the perpetual twilight of her domain, surrounded by souls finding peace in their final rest, Hel embodies a truth that even gods sometimes forget, that endings properly tended are not defeats but completions. While Hel learned to rule with compassion and Jormungandr found purpose in the depths, their brother Fenrir faced a very different fate in Asgard. We touched on his story at the beginning, but now let's return to examine more closely the creation of Gleipnir, that impossible chain that would bind more than just a wolf. After Fenrir had shattered the first 2 chains, Lading and Dromi, like they were made of morning frost, Odin knew that ordinary metalwork would never hold the growing wolf. The All-Father spent sleepless nights in his study, consulting prophecies, seeking wisdom from his ravens, trying to find a solution that wouldn't require him to murder an innocent creature for crimes not yet committed. The answer came, as it often did, through knowledge and cunning, rather than brute force. Odin remembered the dark elves of Alfheim, those master craftsmen who worked with materials that existed at the edges of reality itself. If anyone could create a binding that would hold Fenrir, it would be them. The journey to Alfheim was not one Odin could make openly. The other gods might question his need for such a chain, and Loki, still unaware of what was being planned for his son, might warn Fenrir of the trap being prepared. So Odin went in disguise, as he often did, appearing as a wandering scholar seeking knowledge rather than a king requiring service. The Dark Elves received him in their underground workshops, where the air shimmered with magic, and the sound of hammers rang with otherworldly harmonics. Their leader, an ancient elf, whose hands were stained silver from centuries of working with impossible metals, listened carefully to Odin's carefully worded request. "You seek a chain that cannot be broken," the elf said slowly. "Not difficult, if you're willing to pay the price. But I sense you need something more, a binding that will hold not just the body, but the spirit as well. That requires different materials entirely." Odin nodded. He had wrestled with this problem for months. Physical strength could be contained by physical bonds, but Fenrir was more than just a large wolf. He was intelligent, magical, destined for deeds that would shake the foundations of reality. Ordinary chains might hold his body, but his will would eventually find a way to break free. The elf smiled with the expression of a craftsman presented with an interesting challenge. "We will need to gather materials that exist more in concept than substance. Things that are real but intangible, present but impossible to grasp. The work will take time." And so began one of the strangest collection quests in all mythology. The Dark Elves dispatched their most skilled gatherers to find 6 things that barely existed: the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Imagine trying to capture the sound of a cat walking. Cats, as you know, move with supernatural silence, their paws making no noise even on the creakiest floors. But that silence itself has a quality, a presence that can be felt if not heard. The elves' agents waited in libraries and temples, places where silence had weight and substance, listening for the particular quality of quiet that follows in a cat's wake. The beard of a woman proved equally challenging. In Midgard and Asgard, women grew no beards, but the gatherers had to think more creatively. They sought the wisdom and authority that beards symbolized, finding it in the words of female seers and witches, collecting the power that flowed from voices that commanded respect, despite lacking the visual symbols of masculine authority. Mountain roots required a different approach entirely. Mountains, everyone knew, had no roots in the conventional sense. They were the roots, the fundamental bones of the earth itself, but the elves sought the stability and permanence that roots represented, gathering it from stones that had stood unchanged since the world's creation, from places where the earth's memory ran deepest. Bear sinews should have been simple. Bears were common enough, and their tendons strong and flexible, but the quest called for something more subtle, the particular strength that connected a bear's power to its will, the coordination that allowed such massive creatures to move with surprising grace and precision. The breath of a fish presented its own paradox. Fish breathed water, not air, yet they were undeniably alive and breathing. The gatherers sought this contradiction itself, the life-giving essence that flowed through gills instead of lungs, the adaptation that allowed consciousness to exist in an utterly different element. Finally, bird spittle, the most mundane-sounding ingredient that proved the most difficult to obtain. Birds had no saliva as mammals understood it, yet they preened their feathers with oils from special glands, kept their throats moist for singing, produced the substances that would become the shells of their eggs. The gatherers sought the essence of creation itself, the moisture that transformed potential into reality. For months, the Dark Elves worked to weave these impossible materials into an actual chain. Their forges burned with fires that gave no light. Hammers rang with sounds that made no noise. The work had to be done in absolute secrecy, not just from the gods of Asgard, but from fate itself. If prophecy learned too much about Gleipnir's creation, the chain might lose its power before it was even completed. The finished product was unlike anything ever seen. Gleipnir appeared to be nothing more than a silk ribbon, smooth and soft to the touch, light as a feather, and thin as a hair. It had no weight, made no sound when handled, gave off no scent. To casual observation, it seemed like something a child might use to tie back her hair or bind a bouquet of flowers. But the Dark Elves' leader warned Odin about its true nature as he handed over the completed chain. "This will hold anything you bind with it," he said. "But remember, it is made from contradictions and impossibilities. It will create the very resistance it is designed to overcome. Use it wisely." Odin didn't fully understand this warning. As he carried Gleipnir back to Asgard, he was focused on the immediate problem, containing Fenrir before the wolf grew too large and powerful to manage. The subtler implications of binding someone with their own impossibilities would only become clear later. The testing of Gleipnir played out as we've already seen, the gods pretending it was just another strength contest. Fenrir's growing suspicion, Tyr's sacrifice of his hand to provide the trust that made the binding possible. But what we didn't explore before was what happened inside Gleipnir itself once the wolf was bound. The chain didn't simply prevent Fenrir from moving. It created a feedback loop of frustration and rage. Every time the wolf struggled against bonds made from things that didn't quite exist, his own efforts made the chain stronger. His anger fed into the contradictions that formed Gleipnir's essence, creating exactly the kind of implacable enemy the prophecies had described. In trying to prevent Fenrir from becoming their destroyer, the gods had created the perfect conditions for that transformation. A wolf raised with love might have fought them reluctantly when Ragnarök came, but a wolf betrayed by those he trusted, bound by impossible chains, left to contemplate his rage for centuries, such a creature would devour Odin with joy rather than duty. The Dark Elves' leader had tried to warn about this danger, but some knowledge can only be gained through bitter experience. Gleipnir held Fenrir perfectly, just as promised, but it also held the gods to their fate, binding them to the very future they had tried so desperately to avoid. And somewhere in the depths of the earth where Fenrir lay chained, the wolf learned patience of a different kind than his brother and sister had discovered. Not the peaceful patience of acceptance, but the focused patience of revenge, carefully planned and anticipated with pleasure. These stories of binding and freedom, of choices that echo through eternity, seem to resonate with many of our viewers. If you're finding peace in these ancient tales retold for modern ears, sharing them with others helps create a community of quiet contemplation. Consider subscribing if these midnight mythology sessions are becoming part of your routine. The irony wasn't lost on Loki, who watched his sons binding with growing fury of his own. As he saw Tyr's blood staining the ground of Asgard, heard Fenrir's muffled howls echoing across the realm, he began to understand that his own relationship with the gods had changed forever. The trickster who had once been their ally started planning his own forms of revenge. But that's a story for another time. For now, Gleipnir holds, and Fenrir waits, and the gods tell themselves they've solved their problem, even as they create a dozen new ones they haven't yet recognized. From chains that bind to trees that support, let's turn our attention to the greatest structure in all of Norse cosmology. While Fenrir tests his bonds and dreams of revenge, while his siblings adapt to their new roles in exile, all of their stories unfold within the branches and roots of something far larger than any individual fate: Yggdrasil, the world tree. Picture trying to describe a tree so vast that it contains entire universes in its branches, whose roots dig so deep they tap into the fundamental forces of existence itself. Yggdrasil isn't just large, it's the framework upon which all reality hangs, the cosmic axis that gives meaning to directions like up and down, the living structure that connects every possible form of existence. You might wonder how such a thing could grow. What soil could nourish roots capable of supporting 9 entire worlds? The answer lies in understanding that Yggdrasil isn't quite a tree in the way we normally think of trees. It's more accurate to say it's the idea of connection itself, given form and substance. The principle that all things are linked, taking on the appearance of the most linking thing the Norse mind could imagine. A tree whose branches reach toward every sky, whose roots touch every foundation. The 9 worlds that nestle in Yggdrasil's structure each have their own character, their own inhabitants, their own role in the greater pattern. At the top, in the highest branches where the light is strongest, sits Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, with its golden halls and rainbow bridge, its weapons that never miss their targets, and its mead that flows without end. But even Asgard, mighty as it is, represents just one branch of the great tree. On the same level, sharing the upper reaches but existing in a different kind of space, you'll find Alfheim, the realm of the light elves. These aren't the diminutive garden sprites of later folklore, but beings of pure illumination, creatures who exist at the intersection of light and consciousness. The light elves spend their days, though day and night have different meanings in their realm, crafting objects from crystallized starlight, composing symphonies that can only be heard by those who understand how color and sound relate to each other. Their cities are built from materials that exist only when viewed from certain angles, architecture that challenges even the gods' understanding of what's possible. Descending to the middle level of Yggdrasil, you find Midgard, the middle realm, the world of humans, surrounded by the vast ocean, where Jormungandr makes his patient circles. From the perspective of the world tree, Midgard occupies a special position, not because it's the most powerful realm, but because it represents potential in its purest form. Humans, unlike gods or giants, elves or dwarves, have no fixed nature. They can be wise or foolish, brave or cowardly, creative or destructive, sometimes all within the same individual on the same day. This flexibility makes them unpredictable, even to the Norns who weave fate itself. In the grand pattern of Yggdrasil, Midgard serves as the realm of wildcards and unexpected changes. Sharing the middle level with Midgard, but existing in a slightly different relationship to time and space, lies Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, where Loki's children were born, where ancient wisdom competes with primordial chaos for dominance. Jotunheim represents the forces that existed before order was imposed on the universe, the raw materials from which more structured realities were built. The giants aren't necessarily enemies of order. Many of them are older and wiser than the gods themselves, but they remember what existence was like before rules and boundaries, when all things were possible because nothing was yet defined. Their realm reflects this ancient flexibility: mountains that rearrange themselves overnight, forests where the trees grow in spirals through time rather than space, rivers that flow uphill towards sources that don't yet exist. Also on this middle level sits Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, Odin's equals and occasional rivals, deities of fertility, prosperity and wisdom gained through experience rather than conquest. The Vanir understand magic differently than the Aesir, approaching it through harmony and cooperation rather than domination and binding. Their realm reflects this different philosophy. Where Asgard builds with gold and iron, marble and crystal, Vanaheim grows its structures from living wood and flowing water, creates its most beautiful spaces through careful cultivation rather than magnificent construction. The Vanir cities bloom and change with the seasons, never exactly the same twice, always perfectly adapted to their current needs. Descending deeper into Yggdrasil's structure, you enter the lower realms where different rules apply. Alfheim has its counterpart in Svartalfheim, the realm of the Dark Elves, those master craftsmen who created Gleipnir, who work with materials that exist at the intersection of reality and possibility. Svartalfheim exists primarily underground, in vast cavern systems that honeycomb the roots of the world tree. But don't imagine these as gloomy caves. The Dark Elves have learned to work with different kinds of illumination. Their workshops glow with the light of ideas becoming real, the aurora-like radiance of metals that don't quite exist until they're needed. The Dark Elves create things that challenge the boundaries between categories. They forge metals that are stronger when they're thinner, weapons that become more dangerous the longer they remain unused, tools that work better for those who understand them least. Their greatest creations exist in the spaces between definitions, like Gleipnir, which holds fast because it's made from things that aren't quite there. Even deeper among the roots lies Niflheim, the realm of primordial mist and ice, one of the two fundamental forces from which all existence eventually emerged. Niflheim isn't a place where creatures live so much as a condition that underlies all other conditions: the cold, the dark, the potential for form to emerge from formlessness. In Niflheim, time moves differently than elsewhere in the Nine Worlds. Past and future blend together in the eternal mist, and travelers report meeting their own descendants, having conversations with events that haven't happened yet, discovering that cause and effect follow rules too ancient and fundamental to be easily understood by minds accustomed to linear time. And finally, deepest of all among Yggdrasil's roots, lies Helheim, the realm we've already visited, where Hel rules over the honored dead, with her particular combination of justice and compassion. Helheim exists at the foundation of the world tree, because death is the foundation of life, the certainty that gives weight and meaning to all choices made by mortals and gods alike. But Yggdrasil itself is more than just a container for these nine worlds. It's a living entity with its own needs, its own challenges, its own role to play in the cosmic drama. The great tree faces constant threats that require eternal vigilance to address. 4 stags leap constantly through Yggdrasil's branches, eating the leaves and bark, representing the forces of decay and consumption that threaten all living things. At the base of the tree, the dragon Nidhogg gnaws perpetually at the roots, trying to bring down the entire cosmic structure through patient, persistent destruction. Between the dragon below and the eagle above, a squirrel named Ratatoska runs up and down the trunk, carrying messages, but not helpful ones. Instead, this cosmic gossip specializes in stirring up conflict, carrying insults between the eagle and the dragon, ensuring that their ancient enmity never cools into peaceful coexistence. Yet, despite these constant threats, Yggdrasil endures. 3 wells nourish its roots: the Well of Erd, where the Norns water the tree with sacred spring water mixed with white clay; the Well of Mimir, where wisdom is stored; and Hvergelmir, the spring from which all cold rivers flow. The tree's endurance comes not from being invulnerable, but from being constantly renewed. Every day the damage done by stags and dragon is repaired by the care of the Norns, the nourishment of the wells, and the tree's own tremendous life force. Yggdrasil teaches the lesson that survival isn't about avoiding all damage, but about healing faster than harm accumulates. From its position at the center of all existence, the world tree witnesses everything: Fenrir's binding, Jormungandra's patient swimming, Hel's compassionate rule over the dead. It feels the tremors when gods make decisions that will echo through eternity, provides the framework that allows such vast consequences to unfold in orderly fashion rather than complete chaos. And when Ragnarök finally comes, when all the careful structures of reality face their ultimate test, Yggdrasil will shudder and sway but ultimately survive. After the fire and flooding, after the final battles and the twilight of the gods, the world tree will put forth new leaves, shelter the few survivors, and provide the foundation for whatever reality emerges from the ashes of the old. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself resting in one of Yggdrasil's more comfortable branches, high enough to see the connections between all things, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves that are themselves entire worlds, cradled by the living framework that holds all stories, all possibilities, all dreams within its infinite embrace. Among the roots of Great Yggdrasil, where the world tree draws its nourishment from 3 sacred wells, sits perhaps the most mysterious and powerful source of knowledge in all the 9 worlds. The Well of Mimir has drawn seekers of wisdom since the beginning of time, but few have paid the price required to drink from its waters. The most famous exception, of course, was Odin, and his sacrifice reveals something profound about the true cost of understanding. Picture the All-Father in his younger days, already king of Asgard, already master of considerable magic and wisdom. You might think that someone with access to 2 ravens who could fly anywhere and see everything, someone who possessed an 8-legged horse capable of traveling between worlds, would have all the knowledge anyone could need. But Odin understood something that many powerful beings never learn. There's a difference between information and wisdom. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, could tell him what was happening anywhere in the 9 worlds at any moment, but they couldn't tell him what it all meant, how the events connected to each other, what patterns were forming in the great tapestry of cause and effect. The knowledge that haunted Odin was knowledge of the future, specifically knowledge of Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the end of everything he had built and protected. The prophecies spoke of this ending in fragments and riddles, giving him enough information to know that disaster was coming, but not enough to understand how to prevent it. It was this frustration that drove him to seek out Mimir's well, deep among the roots of Yggdrasil where the light of Asgard never reached. The journey itself was treacherous, requiring him to travel through realms where gods were not welcome, to navigate paths that existed only for those willing to give up everything for the chance of understanding. Mimir himself was a figure of legend, even among the gods. Once he had been a giant of incredible wisdom, trusted by both the Aesir and Vanir gods during their ancient conflicts. But political alliances have a way of turning complicated, and Mimir had eventually been beheaded as part of a particularly ugly peace negotiation gone wrong. The remarkable thing wasn't that Mimir had died. Even gods and giants could be killed under the right circumstances. The remarkable thing was that his head had continued to think, to accumulate wisdom, to understand the deeper patterns of existence, with the clarity that sometimes comes only after death has removed all personal stakes from the game. Odin had preserved Mimir's head with herbs and magic, had spoken charms over it that kept the ancient wisdom alive and growing. But in exchange for this preservation, Mimir had demanded to be taken to the most sacred of the 3 wells beneath Yggdrasil, where he could serve as guardian of wisdom itself. When Odin finally reached the well, he found Mimir's head floating in waters that reflected not the visitor's appearance, but their deepest nature. Looking into the well was like seeing yourself as you truly were, stripped of all pretense and self-deception. Many seekers turned away at this point, unwilling to face such brutal honesty about their own souls. But Odin had come too far to retreat now. "I seek to drink from your well," he told Mimir without preamble. "I need the wisdom to guide my people through what's coming." Mimir's ancient eyes, the only part of him that still moved, studied the All-Father for a long moment before responding. "Many have made that request," he said, his voice like the sound of deep water moving over stone. "Most are not willing to pay the price. Wisdom isn't something you can simply purchase with gold or political favors. Name your price." Odin replied immediately. He had expected this, had known that wisdom always cost more than its seekers initially realized. "I'll pay whatever you ask." Mimir's smile was not entirely kind. "The price is always the same, 1 eye, not taken by violence or accident, but freely given, removed by your own hand and cast into the well as payment. The wisdom you gain will be purchased with your ability to see the physical world as clearly as you once did." The request stopped Odin cold. He had been prepared for various costs, years of service, magical treasures, even portions of his life force. But his eye, the physical sacrifice, seemed almost primitive, like something from the crude early days when magic required blood and pain rather than skill and understanding. Yet as he stood beside the well, Odin began to understand the deeper logic behind Mimir's demand. Wisdom wasn't just about accumulating more information. It was about changing how you perceived information. To see clearly into the future, into the hidden connections between events, he would need to sacrifice some of his ability to see the surface of things. The choice wasn't really about trading 1 eye for wisdom. It was about trading one kind of sight for another, ordinary vision for true seeing, the ability to perceive what was in front of him, for the ability to understand what it all meant. Without further hesitation, Odin drew his knife. The pain was extraordinary. but not in the way he had expected. Physical agony was temporary, something any warrior could endure. The real pain came from the immediate sense of loss, the disorientation that came from suddenly seeing the world from a fundamentally different perspective. He cast his eye into the well, watching it sink into waters that seemed infinitely deep. As it disappeared from sight, knowledge began to flow into his mind, not as words or images, but as a new kind of understanding that bypassed his conscious thoughts entirely. The wisdom he gained wasn't the simple answers to specific questions he had expected. Instead, it was a comprehensive understanding of how events connected across time and space. He could see the threads that linked Loki's growing resentment to Baldur's eventual death, could trace the connections between Fenrir's binding and the final destruction of Asgard. More disturbing than any specific prophecy was the meta-knowledge that came with Mimir's gift. Odin could see that many of the disasters awaiting the gods would be caused by their own attempts to prevent those disasters. The binding of Fenrir, the exile of Loki's children, the increasing paranoia and isolation of Asgard, all of these were necessary steps on the path to Ragnarök. This was the cruelest aspect of the wisdom Odin had purchased. He could see the future clearly enough to know that most of it couldn't be changed. The gods' fate was sealed not by external enemies, but by their own nature, their own choices, their own inability to learn from prophecy rather than simply react to it. Yet there were also glimpses of hope in what Odin learned from the well. Ragnarök wasn't truly an ending. It was a transformation, a necessary clearing away of old patterns to make room for new growth. Some gods would survive, some humans would endure, and the world that emerged from the ashes would have the opportunity to avoid the mistakes that had doomed the current age. When Odin finally left Mimir's well, he was fundamentally changed. The eye patch he wore afterward wasn't just a sign of physical sacrifice, it was a symbol of the different kind of sight he had gained. Where once he had seen surfaces, now he perceived depths. Where once he had reacted to events, now he understood patterns. The other gods noticed the change immediately. Odin's advice became more prophetic, but also more cryptic. He would sometimes make decisions that seemed nonsensical in the moment, but proved wise months or years later. His ability to see immediate physical threats decreased, but his understanding of long-term consequences became nearly perfect. Mimir as well had taught him that true wisdom wasn't about gaining the power to control events, but about understanding when events couldn't be controlled. Some disasters had to be allowed to unfold, some prices had to be paid, some endings had to be accepted before new beginnings became possible. This knowledge isolated Odin in ways that went beyond the physical loss of his eye. He could see tragedies approaching that he couldn't prevent, could understand the necessity of allowing friends to make choices that would ultimately destroy them. Wisdom, he learned, was often its own burden. But it also gave him a different kind of peace. Instead of constantly fighting against fate, he could work with it, guiding events toward the best possible outcomes, even when those outcomes involved loss and sacrifice. He became less a king trying to prevent all problems, and more a gardener helping things grow toward their proper conclusions. And late at night, when the weight of knowledge became particularly heavy, Odin would sometimes return to Mimir's well. Not to drink again, one such sacrifice was enough for any lifetime, but to sit beside the waters and discuss what he had learned with the ancient head that floated there, eternally wise, eternally patient. These conversations helped Odin understand that wisdom wasn't a destination, but a journey, that each sacrifice opened new questions, even as it answered old ones. The eye he had given up continued to see from within the well's depths, perceiving truths that his remaining eye could never access. The wisdom Odin gained from Mimir's well was profound, but it came with a troubling realization. There were deeper mysteries still beyond his reach. The ancient symbols he glimpsed in his enhanced visions, the strange markings that seemed to hold power over the very fabric of reality itself, remained frustratingly unclear. These were the runes, and obtaining them would require a sacrifice that made the loss of an eye seem almost trivial. Picture Odin, in the months following his visit to the well, sitting in his great hall as twilight settled over Asgard. The other gods would find him staring into the fire, his remaining eye unfocused, as if he were seeing something far beyond the dancing flames. What he saw were glimpses of symbols that could bind fate itself, letters that weren't just written but woven into the fundamental structure of existence. The runes weren't a human invention, nor were they created by the gods. They were older than memory, patterns that had existed since the first words were spoken into the void, the original language that reality used to describe itself. But they were hidden, locked away in places that could only be reached through the most extreme forms of seeking. You might wonder why someone who already possessed incredible wisdom would risk everything for more knowledge. But Odin understood something that drove him beyond ordinary caution. The approaching darkness of Ragnarök couldn't be prevented, but perhaps it could be survived. The runes held secrets about continuation, about how endings could become beginnings, about the deep magic that would allow something precious to persist through even the twilight of the gods. The path to the runes led back to Yggdrasil, but not to its roots where the wells of wisdom waited. Instead, Odin's new sight showed him that the ancient symbols hung suspended in the branches of the world tree, visible only to those who approached from a very specific perspective, the perspective of someone suspended between life and death, belonging fully to neither state. This is where the most famous and mysterious of Odin's sacrifices began. On a night when the aurora danced with unusual intensity across the northern sky, the All-Father made his way alone to a particular grove, where Yggdrasil's branches hung low enough for a determined climber to reach them. He carried with him a spear, Gungnir, his own weapon, sharp enough to pierce divine flesh. What happened next challenges our understanding of sacrifice and wisdom. Odin didn't simply tie himself to the tree like a prisoner awaiting execution. Instead, he performed a ritual that was part sacrifice, part experiment, and part meditation. He stabbed himself with his own spear and hung himself from Yggdrasil's branches, creating the precise conditions needed to perceive the hidden runes. The experience wasn't like ordinary dying, suspended between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Wounded but not quite killed, Odin entered a state of consciousness that had no name, because no one had ever deliberately sought it before. Time moved differently in this suspended state. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days, days like years. Hunger was the first challenge. Gods, unlike mortals, weren't accustomed to true deprivation, and the gnawing emptiness in Odin's stomach became a constant companion. But as days passed without food or water, the hunger transformed into something else, a clarity of purpose that came from having no distractions, no comfort to cloud his perception. Thirst followed, more urgent than hunger, making his mouth feel like leather, and his thoughts occasionally scatter like leaves in wind. Yet this too became part of the process, each discomfort stripping away another layer of ordinary consciousness, bringing him closer to the state where the runes might reveal themselves. Pain was constant but changing. The wound from his spear throbbed with his heartbeat. The rope around his neck restricted his breathing just enough to keep him constantly aware of each breath. His muscles cramped from maintaining the same position. His joints ached from supporting weight they weren't meant to bear for extended periods. But it was the isolation that proved most challenging, hanging alone among the branches of Yggdrasil, with no one to speak to, no distractions from his internal experience. Odin was forced to confront aspects of himself that busy leadership had allowed him to avoid. He faced his fears about the future, his guilt over decisions that had harmed innocence, his doubts about whether wisdom was worth the prices he kept paying for it. The other gods, discovering their king missing, searched everywhere before finally finding him hanging in the grove. Their horror at seeing the All-Father suspended and wounded was matched only by their confusion when he refused their help. 9 days and 9 nights, he told them through cracked lips. I must complete what I've begun. So they kept watch from a distance, taking turns to ensure their king wasn't completely alone, but respecting his determination to see the ordeal through. Frigg wept quietly in her chambers, while Thor paced the halls of Asgard like a caged wolf, wanting desperately to cut his father down, but knowing that interfering would make the sacrifice meaningless. It was on the 9th night, when Odin had reached the very edge of what even divine constitution could endure, that the runes finally revealed themselves. They didn't appear gradually or gently, they blazed into his consciousness, all at once, 24 symbols that contained within themselves the fundamental principles governing existence itself. Each rune was more than a letter, it was a concept made visible, a force given form. Fjords represented not just cattle or wealth, but the life energy that flows between all things. Uruz embodied not just the aurochs, the great wild ox, but the raw strength that underlies all creation. Thesaurus held not just the power of the giants, but the chaotic forces that challenge all established order. The knowledge hit Odin like lightning, each rune burning itself into his memory with such intensity that he cried out the first sound he had made in days. With the runes came understanding of how they could be combined, how their meanings layered and interacted, how they could be used to influence fate, to bind oaths that couldn't be broken, to protect what needed protecting and change what needed changing. But perhaps more importantly, the runes showed Odin how to teach. The symbols weren't meant to be hoarded by one individual, no matter how wise. They were tools that could be shared, knowledge that became more powerful when more minds understood its applications. The price he had paid wasn't just for his own enlightenment, but for the ability to pass transformative wisdom to others. When Odin finally cut himself down from the tree, he was fundamentally changed once again. The eye he had sacrificed to Mimir's well had given him deep sight into the connections between events. The ordeal on Yggdrasil had given him the tools to influence those connections, to write new possibilities into the fabric of reality itself. His first act was to carve the runes into his spear Gungnir, transforming it from merely an accurate weapon into something that could strike at concepts as well as physical targets. His second was to begin teaching select gods and mortals how to read and use the ancient symbols, spreading knowledge that would survive even if Asgard itself didn't. The runes proved to be exactly what Odin had hoped. Not a way to prevent Ragnarök, but a way to ensure that something valuable would persist beyond it. Mortals who learned the symbols could use them to preserve their most important stories, their essential wisdom, their deepest understanding of how to live well in a challenging world. If you're finding these quiet explorations of ancient wisdom helpful for winding down, consider subscribing to join others who appreciate these gentle journeys into mythology's deeper meanings. There's something peaceful about contemplating the lengths people will go to for understanding, isn't there? As Odin recovered from his ordeal, he sometimes wondered if there was more knowledge still to be gained, more prices to be paid. But for now, the runes provided tools sufficient for the challenges ahead. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he began to form plans for acquiring another kind of wisdom entirely, the kind that came not from sacrifice and suffering, but from cleverness, and perhaps just a touch of theft. From the hard-won wisdom of the runes, Odin's attention turned to a different kind of knowledge, the kind that flowed like honey and made even the simplest words sparkle with meaning. There existed somewhere in the Nine Worlds a substance that could transform anyone who drank it into a master poet, capable of speaking truths so beautiful that listeners would remember them forever. This was the mead of poetry, and naturally, it was in the hands of giants who had no intention of sharing. The story of how this magical drink came to exist is stranger than most tales, beginning not with brewing or cooking, but with an exchange of saliva. When the Aesir and Vanir gods made peace after their ancient war, they decided to seal their treaty in an unusual way. Each god would spit into a great cauldron, and from this mingled essence, they would create a being who embodied the combined wisdom of both divine families. Picture this ceremony, held in a neutral location between Asgard and Vanaheim, with representatives of both godly tribes gathered in their finest robes. The cauldron they used was ancient even then, carved from a single massive stone, and inscribed with symbols that predated the runes themselves. One by one, gods who had been enemies just days before contributed their essence to the same vessel. From this unusual mixture emerged Kvasir, a being unlike any other. He possessed the combined knowledge of every god who had contributed to his creation. But more than that, he had the ability to make that knowledge accessible to anyone, where other wise beings might speak in riddles or demand payment for their insights. Kvasir could explain the most complex truths in ways that even children could understand. Kvasir spent his days traveling between the Nine Worlds, sharing wisdom freely with anyone who asked. He would sit with farmers and explain how the movements of stars related to the best times for planting. He would visit craftsmen and show them techniques that made their work both easier and more beautiful. He would counsel kings on justice and teach children songs that helped them remember important lessons. This golden age of shared knowledge couldn't last forever. Of course, there lived in Midgard two dwarves named Frishalar and Galar, brothers who possessed great skill in crafting but terrible personalities. They were the kind of dwarves who measured their worth by what others lacked, who found more pleasure in hoarding than in creating. When Kvasir visited their workshop, offering to share insights that could improve their metalworking, the brothers saw not an opportunity to learn, but a resource to be captured. They invited the wise being to a private demonstration of their finest work, then murdered him when his attention was focused on admiring their craftsmanship. But here's where their crime became something more complex than simple murder. The brothers collected Kvasir's blood in 3 containers, 2 cauldrons named Son and Bovan, and a kettle called Ortharir. They mixed this divine blood with honey gathered from bees that had fed on flowers growing in sacred groves, creating a fermented drink that contained all of Kvasir's wisdom in liquid form. Anyone who drank this mead would become a skilled poet and wise speaker, able to craft words that moved hearts and changed minds. The brothers had intended to keep it for themselves, transforming from crude craftsmen into the most eloquent beings in all the worlds. But wisdom, it turns out, can't be stolen without consequences. The dwarves' newfound eloquence went to their heads immediately. They began composing boastful poems about their superiority, insulting everyone they met with increasingly creative verbal attacks. When a giant named Gilling visited their workshop with his wife, the brothers couldn't resist demonstrating their wit by composing mocking verses about the couple's appearance and mannerisms. This proved to be a fatal mistake. Giants, while not always quick to anger, have very long memories and very large relatives. Gilling's son Suttungro was particularly fond of his parents, and particularly skilled at revenge. When he learned of their deaths, the dwarves had escalated from insults to murder with disturbing ease. He captured Feilar and Galar, and carried them to a small island that would be completely submerged at high tide. Faced with drowning, the brothers offered their only valuable possession, the mead that contained Kvasir's wisdom. Suttungray accepted this payment, but took precautions to ensure the precious drink wouldn't be misused again. He transported it to a mountain called Hnitbjerg, where he built a secure chamber deep within the stone, and set his daughter Gunnlöd to guard it. Now, you might think this is where the story would end. Wisdom locked away by cautious giants, safely protected from those who might abuse it. But Odin had learned about the mead's existence through his network of ravens and wanderers, and he understood that such knowledge was too valuable to remain hidden. The approaching darkness of Ragnarök meant that wisdom needed to be preserved and spread, not hoarded. Odin's plan to steal the mead was characteristically complex, relying more on patience and deception than on force. He began by disguising himself as a wanderer named Belvakr, taking employment with Bogi, who happened to be Suttungr's brother. This wasn't coincidence. Odin had researched the giant's family connections carefully. As Belvakr, Odin proved to be an exceptionally valuable worker. He could do the work of 9 ordinary laborers, never seemed to tire, and possessed knowledge of farming techniques that dramatically improved crop yields. By the end of the growing season, Bogi was thoroughly impressed with his mysterious employee. When Odin requested payment in the form of a drink from his brother's precious mead, Bogi was willing to help, but admitted the task was nearly impossible. Suttungr had refused all previous requests for even a sip of the divine drink, and the mountain fortress where it was stored had been designed to keep out intruders. This is where Odin's plan revealed its true cleverness. He convinced Bogi to help him drill a hole through the mountain, claiming they could create a passage small enough to avoid detection, but large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. The work took days, with Bogi operating a drill that Odin had designed using principles learned during his study of the runes. When they finally broke through into the chamber where the mead was stored, Odin transformed himself into a snake and slithered through the narrow passage. This transformation wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, representing the kind of flexibility required to obtain wisdom from those reluctant to share it. Inside the mountain chamber, Odin found Gunnlöd sitting beside the 3 containers of mead, as she had every day for years. She was beautiful in the way that giant maidens often were, not delicate like elven women or fierce like goddesses, but with the kind of substantial presence that suggested deep roots and unshakable strength. More importantly for Odin's purposes, she was lonely. Years of guarding the mead in isolation had left her hungry for conversation, for someone who could appreciate the responsibility she carried and the sacrifice she made in fulfilling it. When the disguised god offered companionship, she accepted gratefully. For 3 days and nights, Odin courted Gunnlöd with stories of his travels, songs from distant lands, and the kind of attention that someone isolated for years finds irresistible. He listened to her speak about the weight of her duty, the beauty of the poetry that flowed from the mead, the dreams she'd abandoned to become its guardian. In return for 3 nights of love and companionship, Gunnlöd allowed her visitor 3 drinks from the precious mead. She intended this as a generous but limited gift. 3 sips of the divine drink, enough to grant poetic skill but not enough to seriously deplete her store. But Odin had not spent years learning wisdom to be limited by conventional interpretations. With his first drink, he emptied the entire cauldron orderer. With his second, he drained Bothen completely. His third drink consumed every drop remaining in Som. In 3 massive swallows, he had taken all of Kvasir's preserved wisdom into himself. Gunnlöd's shock and horror were immediate, but Odin was already transforming again, this time into an eagle, and launching himself toward the opening he had drilled in the mountain wall. Behind him, he could hear her cries of alarm, and the sound of horns being blown to alert her father and uncle to the theft. The flight back to Asgard became an epic chase, with Suttungred in his own eagle form pursuing the thief who had stolen his treasure and betrayed his daughter's trust. The race covered vast distances across multiple realms, with both eagles pushing themselves to their physical limits. As they flew, Odin faced a dilemma. The mead within him was so powerful, so concentrated with divine essence, that he could feel it beginning to transform his very being. If he carried it all the way to Asgard, he might arrive as something other than himself, his personality completely overwhelmed by Kvasir's preserved wisdom. His solution was as practical as it was generous. During the flight, Odin began regurgitating small amounts of the mead, letting drops fall onto Midgard below. These drops, landing on ordinary mortals, instantly granted them poetic abilities of varying degrees. This is why, according to the myth, some humans have natural gifts for beautiful speech, while others struggle to express themselves clearly. By the time Odin reached Asgard, he had retained enough of the mead to become the greatest poet among the gods, while ensuring that the gift of eloquent speech was distributed among humans who could use it to preserve important stories and wisdom through the dark times ahead. The theft had consequences, that rippled through all the 9 worlds. Gunnloth was left heartbroken and humiliated, her trust betrayed by someone who had seemed to genuinely care for her. Suttungrid's rage at the theft added to the growing tension between giants and gods, contributing to the conflicts that would eventually culminate in Ragnarök. But the preserved wisdom of Kvasir was now available to inspire poets, storytellers, and wisdom keepers who would ensure that the most important truths survived even the twilight of the gods. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries the sound of distant voices telling old stories, you can still taste the sweetness of that stolen mead in words that seem to sparkle with more than mortal understanding. As our journey through these quiet Norse tales draws to a close, let's turn to one final story that reveals how even the gods could find themselves caught between their desires and their promises. After all of Odin's quests for wisdom, his sacrifice at Mimir's well, his hanging on Yggdrasil, his theft of the mead of poetry, Asgard still faced a fundamental problem that no amount of knowledge could solve. The realm of the gods needed better defenses, but building them would require resources the gods simply didn't possess. Picture Asgard, in those early days, magnificent but vulnerable. The golden halls gleamed in perpetual sunlight, the rainbow bridge Bifrost provided convenient access to other realms, and the gods lived in comfort that would have been the envy of any mortal kingdom. But for all its beauty, Asgard lacked the one thing that every ruler knows is essential: strong walls to keep enemies out and treasures safe within. The problem wasn't a lack of vision. The gods could imagine exactly what they wanted. Walls so high that giants couldn't climb them, so thick that no weapon could breach them, so extensive that they could protect every hall and garden in the divine realm. The problem was practical. Such construction would require decades of work by the gods themselves, taking them away from their other duties of maintaining order across the 9 worlds. What made him noteworthy was his proposal. He claimed to be a master builder, capable of constructing walls around Asgard that would be impregnable for all time. More importantly, he was willing to do this work alone, requiring no assistance from the gods beyond access to local stone and timber. It was during one of their regular assemblies, when the gods gathered to discuss matters of cosmic importance, that the solution appeared, though they didn't recognize it as such at first. A stranger approached the gates of Asgard, leading a magnificent horse whose size and strength suggested it was no ordinary animal. The stranger himself was unremarkable, in the way that made you look twice. Not ugly, but not particularly handsome. Not obviously powerful, but carrying himself with quiet confidence. Not richly dressed, but his simple clothes were well made and showed no signs of hard travel, despite his apparent journey from distant lands. He wanted 3 things as compensation for his labor: the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja as his wife. In other words, he was asking for control over the light that illuminated all the worlds, plus marriage to one of the most beloved and powerful goddesses in Asgard. The gods were intrigued but cautious. Such an offer seemed too good to be true, and they had learned to be suspicious of bargains that appeared too favorable. When they asked about payment, however, the stranger made a request that gave them serious pause. The initial reaction was immediate rejection. Give up the sun and moon? Impossible. The worlds would be plunged into eternal darkness. Crops would fail, and chaos would ensue, and Freyja, beautiful, wise, fierce Freyja, was not property to be traded for construction services, no matter how impressive. But as the gods debated among themselves, Loki raised an interesting point. What if they agreed to the contract but set impossible conditions? They could specify that the work must be completed within a single winter, working entirely alone. No mortal builder, no matter how skilled, could construct walls around all of Asgard in such a short time without assistance. This way, they reasoned, they could get some useful construction work done at no cost, since the builder would inevitably fail to meet the deadline and forfeit any right to payment. It seemed like the kind of clever solution that benefited everyone, except the builder, who would waste months of effort on an impossible task. The stranger listened to these conditions with no visible concern. Yes, he could complete the work in a single winter. Yes, he would work entirely alone, with no assistance from gods or mortals. He had only one small request. He wanted permission to use his horse to help transport stones and timber. The horse worked with the focused intensity of a creature that understood the importance of the task. During the day, while the builder shaped and fitted stones with impossible precision, Svarfasilfari would range across the mountains of Jotunheim, selecting and quarrying the finest building materials. At night, when most workers would rest, the stallion continued laboring, transporting massive loads across difficult terrain. This seemed reasonable enough. A horse, even a large and strong one, wouldn't fundamentally change the impossibility of the task. The gods agreed to the modified contract, congratulating themselves on their cleverness, while the stranger began work immediately. What they discovered over the following days was that Svarfasilfari, for that was the horse's name, was no ordinary animal. The stallion was massive, intelligent, and possessed strength that defied natural limits. While the builder worked with skill and speed that seemed almost supernatural, Svarfasilfari hauled enormous stone blocks that should have required teams of oxen to move. With just 3 days remaining until the deadline, the gods faced an uncomfortable reality. The stranger was going to succeed. Asgard would have the impregnable walls they had wanted, but the price would be catastrophic. Without the sun and moon, all the worlds would suffer. And Freyja, the thought of losing her to this mysterious builder was unbearable to contemplate. As winter progressed, it became clear that the impossible was becoming inevitable. The walls rose with alarming speed, each section more impressive than the last. The construction wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, with stones fitted so perfectly that no mortar was needed, with curves and angles that seemed to flow naturally from the landscape itself. More troubling still, the builder showed no signs of the exhaustion that should have overcome anyone attempting such a massive project alone. If anything, he seemed to gain energy as the work progressed, as if the act of creation itself was sustaining him. On the night before the final day, when Svarfasilfari set out to collect the last stones needed to complete the walls, Loki followed, using his shape-shifting abilities. He transformed himself into a beautiful mare, and appeared where the stallion could see him. The gods' panic was matched only by their anger at themselves for agreeing to such terms. But a contract was a contract, and divine beings were bound by their oaths in ways that mortals could barely understand. Breaking such an agreement would have consequences that went far beyond the immediate crisis. It was Loki, whose clever suggestion had created this mess, who proposed a solution. If the builder's success depended on his horse's impossible strength and endurance, then perhaps the horse could be distracted at a crucial moment. It would require careful timing and considerable personal risk, but it might be their only option. The result was immediate and dramatic. Svarfasilfari, who had worked with single-minded dedication for months, suddenly abandoned his task. The call of nature proved stronger than duty or deadline, and the great stallion chased Loki's mare formed deep into the forests of Jotunheim. The stranger's reaction to this failure revealed his true nature. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by the terrible rage of a giant, for that's what he had been all along, one of the frost giants who had infiltrated Asgard through clever disguise and patient planning. Without his horse, the builder found himself truly working alone for the first time. The final sections of wall that should have been completed easily became impossible challenges. As the sun set on the last day of winter, small but crucial gaps remained in Asgard's defenses. The walls of Asgard stood nearly complete, their gaps eventually filled by more conventional construction methods. The gods had their defenses, Freyja remained free, and the sun and moon continued their courses across the sky. But the episode left them with important lessons about the dangers of clever contracts and the unexpected ways that problems could create new opportunities. Yet even in victory, the gods faced an unexpected consequence of their clever scheme. Months later, Loki returned to Asgard, leading a young foal, grey, 8-legged, and possessed of speed that surpassed even his remarkable father. This was Gleipnir, who would become Odin's mount and the swiftest creature in all the 9 worlds. This revelation simplified the gods' moral dilemma considerably. They had been tricked by an enemy who sought to steal their light, and one of their own as payment for work he had never intended to complete honestly. When Thor arrived with his hammer Mjolnir, the gods felt no guilt about the giant's swift and violent end. Most importantly, it reminded them that in a universe full of shapeshifters and tricksters, strangers bearing generous offers, and horses that were more than they seemed, wisdom lay not just in acquiring knowledge, but in understanding when that knowledge revealed the need for action, for courage, and sometimes for accepting that even gods made mistakes that had to be lived with. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through these Norse myths, perhaps you can find your own rest more easily than the gods ever could. Their stories remind us that even divine beings struggled with choices, consequences, and the complexity of trying to do right in a universe that didn't always reward good intentions. If these quiet retellings have helped ease you towards sleep, consider sharing them with others who might find peace in ancient wisdom told with modern gentleness. And may your own rest be deeper and more peaceful than that of gods who bore the weight of all the worlds on their shoulders. Sleep well, friends. The stories will be here when you wake, patient as the world tree itself, ready to offer their quiet comfort whenever you need it most.